We have recorded over 2 million species scientifically, and of those, it's surprising how many of them are getting rarer by the year. In this video, we're looking at 10 species of plant, animal, and fungus that are among the rarest in the world. This is my 4th video on rare animals, so if you enjoy it, make sure you check out the others. Now let's take a look at the species. In the early 1970s, researchers came across subfossils of an unknown megabat. Archaeologist Susan Bulmer found the bones in 12,000-year-old human refuse heaps, and they stood out for their unique teeth, as they lacked lower incisors. This led to them being placed in a new genus, Aproteles, meaning incomplete in the front. They were assumed to have gone extinct about 9,000 years ago, but researchers were in for a surprise. In 1975, only a few years after the species was described, a few bats were collected from a cave near Telefomin, Papua New Guinea. These bats also lacked lower incisors, and it turned out that Bulmer's fruit bat was alive and living in at least this one cave. Locals said that they seemed to be locally abundant, as they regularly went to the cave to hunt the bats. Sadly, 2 years later, when researchers returned to the cave to study them, they found that they were all gone. The local people had overhunted in the cave, and now it was feared that Bulmer's fruit bat may have gone extinct. In the early 1990s, some researchers were looking into the megabats of the region when they came across an interesting specimen that had been collected in 1984. It was a Bulmer's fruit bat, and it was proof that the species still existed at least 7 years after the cave was found empty. Amazingly, the specimen was recorded as having been collected from the same cave as before. So in 1992, researchers went back to check it out again, and discovered that the bats had in fact returned. They counted a total of 137 bats, far fewer than were known to have lived in the cave back in the 1970s. While other bones of Bulmer's fruit bats were found in one other cave, their presence there has not yet been confirmed. To this day, only the one population is known to exist, and it doesn't exceed more than 160 animals, making them one of the rarest species of mammal in the world. In 1985, 2 Dutch researchers, Jan Wolf and his friend Jan Klomp, were studying plants that grow on other plants known as epiphytes. They were looking in the cloud forests of the central Andes of Colombia. The pair traveled through an area of the mountains known for its coffee plantations, and they decided to stop and explore a tiny fragment of forest that was surrounded by plantations on every side, to see what species might be hiding up in the canopy. They chose to start with one of the largest trees in the patch of forest. Klomp put a rope up into the canopy and began to climb, while Wolf measured the diameters of trees from the ground. Suddenly, Klomp said from the canopy that he saw an unusual white flower growing on the tree. Wolf also found a few fallen flowers and seed pods on the ground. He immediately knew that this was a species of Magnolia, but in all the research that he had done on this stretch of forest, there had been no mention of any species of Magnolia in the region. So he took his botanical collection to an expert in Bogota, who identified the species as being new to science, and it was described as Magnolia wolfii. Its great height, large ovate, dark green shiny leaves of more than 20 centimeters long and 10 centimeters wide, large flowers, and woody globosa fruits of more than 10 centimeters in diameter when closed and some 20 centimeters wide when opened, containing some 40 bright red seeds on average, makes this evergreen tree not only a unique, but also a truly magnificent Magnolia species. After returning to conduct further research, Wolf found 2 more of the trees living in the same patch of forest. All 3 were healthy, having fruit and flowers all year round. But oddly, he didn't seem to be able to find any saplings, only the 3 adult trees. Wolf wasn't too worried, as he assumed that plenty more of the magnolias would soon be discovered in similar patches of forest in the region. But he was wrong. Due to the extreme rarity of the species, in 2008, the Magnolia Society established a program to try to cultivate the trees and safeguard them from extinction. Amazingly, in 2009, another Magnolia wolfii was discovered in that same tiny patch of forest, as well as 2 new adult specimens in another small patch about 6 kilometers away, bringing the total mature population to 6 in the wild. 7 more saplings were also found in the original patch of forest, bringing hope that, while they seemed to do so slowly, magnolias were in fact successfully reproducing in the wild. By 2010, at least 1,000 seeds had been germinated through the Magnolia Society's cultivation program, and they began to be introduced to regions where they had since disappeared. While this is great news for Magnolia wolfii, there are still only 6 mature trees in the entire world, making them one of the rarest species on Earth. "100 years ago, a species of brain coral was described from the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. The Chagos brain coral was extremely abundant, being one of the 25 most common species to occur on the reef. The Chagos brain corals are a pale tan color, very round, and covered in the distinctive grooved surface that gives brain corals their name. They are a shallow water species, being found between 3 and 45 meters in depth. Despite once being one of the most abundant species on the reef, a series of events in the 2010s changed that. In 2015, ocean temperatures around the Chagos archipelago rose to above normal levels, and the corals responded by expelling all of the algae that they rely on to survive. The reef turned white in a process known as coral bleaching. Thankfully, the temperatures eventually returned to normal, and the reef began to recover. But then it happened again the very next year. This time, many of the corals were unable to survive. By the end of 2016, much of the reef was dead, including, it seemed, all of the Chagos brain coral. The species was feared to have gone extinct, so in 2020, a team of 93 scientists was put together from 24 global institutions, and in early March of that year, they set out on their search. The team searched for the species without any luck for several days, before one was finally found holding on all by itself. Sadly, right after the dive where the coral was rediscovered, international news put an end to the research project. Coronavirus was declared a global pandemic, shutting everything down and forcing the team to return to their home countries. Amazingly, in 2021, the team got special permission to return to search for the coral again. It took days of searching before they were rewarded. On a single wall, they managed to discover a small population of 15 or 16 Chagos brain corals. In all their searching, only the one population was found, and it was feared that their density was too low to be able to reproduce naturally. So the decision was made to take some samples of the coral back to the UK, to the Khaled bin Sultan Living Oceans Foundation, where researchers have begun to study the species in order to replicate the specific breeding conditions necessary for the Chagos brain coral. A recovery plan has been developed, and hopefully soon, captive-bred Chagos brain corals will be able to be reintroduced to the reef in order to boost the population density and ensure their survival. For now, only the one population of no more than 16 Chagos brain coral is known to survive in the wild, and if the oceans continue to warm, there may be no chance of the species ever recovering, even if the reintroductions are successful. In 1996, subscribers to the Nat History India electronic newsletter read about an interesting bird that was spotted in northeastern India. The year prior, someone was in Arunachal Pradesh doing some bird watching at around 2,000 meters. They were observing species along some disturbed hillsides that were covered in brush and small trees when they saw what they thought might have been an Bugun Liocichla. The reason this was a rare thing to spot was because this species was only known from the Chengdu region of China, nearly 1,000 kilometers away. It was believed to be an Bugun Liocichla because it had the same color scheme, namely olive gray, black, red, and yellow. But the placement of the colors seemed to be slightly different. The red was restricted to the tips of the wings and tail, and there was a distinctive yellow-red mask and black cap. For the next 10 years, no one could find this mystery bird, and it was believed to have possibly been a vagrant. Then, in 2005, a birdwatcher named Ramana Athreya spotted the strange bird again in Arunachal Pradesh. Being that he wasn't totally certain it was a new species, the find wasn't publicized. Over the next year, the birds were studied. The species was extremely rare, appearing in small flocks in January and then in pairs by the mating season in May. Only 14 of the birds could be found, which meant that capturing a type specimen to put into a museum collection was out of the question. Instead, mist nets were used to capture a single female bird, and feathers were taken and used to describe the species as Liocichla bugunorum, the Bugun Liocichla. Only 3 breeding pairs are known to exist of this species, and they are still only known to be found in one tiny spot of disturbed forest. It's hoped that they could have a range that includes similar habitat nearby, but no one has been able to find any other population of the bird. They're estimated to have a total population of as low as 25 and are listed as critically endangered. Finding more populations of the species is extremely important, as there are plans to build a highway straight through their critical habitat. In 2005, a group from the Field Naturalists Club of Victoria in southeastern Australia were exploring the Jack Can Reserve northwest of Melbourne. As they documented the species they came across, they noticed a fungus that was new to them on a tree right near the car park. It was small and brown, with what looked like little fleshy tan teeth. This led to it being referred to as the Stemless Earpick. It was only found on the bark of a single tree, and despite its distinctive appearance, it wasn't a known species. Year after year, members of the FNCV would visit the spot, and with regularity in the winter months of July and August, some of the fruiting bodies would be observed. Every year, the group would try to record it, and still, it only occurred on the one tree. Then, in 2019, an exciting announcement was made. A second population of the fungus had finally been discovered near Olinda in the Dandenong Ranges east of Melbourne. Here too, it only occurred on one tree. It's estimated that the species might only survive on 5 trees at most at each site, and certainly doesn't have a population that exceeds 500. They're awaiting to be assessed as a species, and in the meantime, they're considered to be critically endangered and at a high risk of extinction, as forest fires are becoming more and more common in Australia in recent years. Living in a few scattered forests in Tanzania is a small species of antelope known as Abbot's Duiker. The species lives mostly in wet forests and swamps above 2,000 meters in elevation, where they remain hidden in the thick understory. The species is cryptic, being brown and gray with a red tuft of fur on the top of their head. Despite the fact that they were well known by local people and described scientifically in 1890, no photograph of the species existed until 2003. While it is an ungulate, it's only mostly herbivorous. In fact, Abbot's duiker has been observed catching and eating frogs, and is known to spend periods of time surviving on small animals it preys on. They are also extremely alert and able to defend themselves. On occasion, they'll be attacked by people's dogs, but it's often the dog that ends up dying in the attack. Unfortunately, much of their habitat has been destroyed and disturbed, and the species is subjected to high levels of poaching. With no captive population anywhere in the world, the last assessment of the species estimated that there are no more than 1,500 Abbot's duiker left in the wild. But with a rapidly decreasing population, and having not been assessed in nearly a decade, their actual population today is likely much lower than that. Across Japan's largest island, Honshu, once lived a small, inconspicuous species of fish that is now almost gone. The kissing loach lives much of its life in fast-moving, muddy streams and rivers, but in the breeding season, it seeks a specific environment that meets its breeding requirements. The loaches leave the rivers and move into recently flooded areas to mate and lay their eggs. They require clear, shallow water, about 20 centimeters in depth, with terrestrial vegetation on the bottom. As humans altered the floodplains for agriculture, the kissing loaches began to rely on man-made environments for reproduction, like ditches and rice paddies. Over the years, land use changed dramatically across Japan, and the kissing loach lost much of its habitat to urbanization, eventually becoming restricted to a few rivers and streams, particularly around the city of Kamioka near Kyoto. In fact, one of their last and most important spawning grounds was in the heart of the city, in an area that still experienced natural seasonal flooding. In 2012, the government of the city announced a plan to build a sports stadium on this exact spot, raising the ground level to stop the flooding and destroying the primary spawning ground of this critically endangered fish. Thankfully, environmental and conservation organizations spoke up and warned the government of the plight of this endemic Japanese fish. After 4 years of discussion, the government was finally convinced to move the construction to another site in order to protect the kissing loach from extinction. Today, there are only an estimated 800 wild kissing loaches living in 3 tiny locations on the island of Honshu. In 1953, a new species of tree boa was described from Brazil's Atlantic forest. Cropani's boa has a laterally compressed body that can measure up to 2 meters in length, and it's black, brown, and tan with a more vibrant yellow-orange head. The holotype was placed in a museum collection, and over the following decades, the species was only recorded 3 more times, with each of these other records being the discovery of dead animals. It seemed that the snake only survived in a small patch of forest, about 300 square kilometers in size, around the city of Sao Paulo. Sadly, a fire in 2019 at the institute that housed the holotype specimen destroyed it, and only the other 3 specimens remained in museum collections. The Atlantic forest of Brazil is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, with only about 7% of it remaining. Many of the endemic species in this habitat have already gone extinct, and many more are critically endangered. So scientists wanted to know if Cropani's boa was still out there. They began a public education campaign, making local people aware of the existence of this incredibly rare species, hoping that if someone came upon it, they would report it to researchers. In January 2017, a local resident in the Ribera Valley region came upon a boa and prepared to kill it, as this was the regular custom when snakes were found. Thankfully, 2 bystanders saw the snake and recognized it from the educational campaign, stopping the snake from being killed. They managed to collect it and take it to researchers who confirmed that it was in fact Cropani's tree boa, and only the second ever record of a living specimen. The rescued boa was a female that measured 170 centimeters long. After studying her for a while, she was fitted with a radio transmitter and released back into the forest. The population of the species is unknown and assumed to be extremely low. It has only ever been seen alive twice, recorded a total of 5 times, and has never been observed in the wild by researchers. Without doing more to stop the destruction of Brazil's Atlantic forest, the species may soon be lost forever. Up until 2017, New Zealand only had 4 recognized native species of frog, all of which belonged to the primitive genus Leiopelma. They're different from other frog species in several key ways. For one, they have 1 more vertebrae than other frogs do. Second, they don't use their tongues to catch prey, instead gulping it up with their mouths and using their arms to push it in. They have no external eardrums, and they also don't croak. One of these 4 native species is Hamilton's frog, and it's among the rarest amphibians in the world. These small frogs are mostly brown, with a single dark line that runs on either side of the head. They're a very special species, not just because of how primitive they are, but also because they are the longest-lived species of frog in the world. Studies have shown that Hamilton's frogs can live to be as much as 40 years old. They once ranged throughout much of the southern part of the North Island and the northern part of the South Island, but the introduction of black rats devastated their population. Over the last 150 years, they disappeared from almost all of their range, becoming restricted to Stevens Island, which has remained rat-free. Despite escaping the dangers of the introduction of rats on the island, their range is now seriously restricted. Only at most 300 frogs are able to survive on the island at any given time. But in 2017, the species got a huge boost to their numbers. Genetic analysis done on the 4 Leiopelma species in New Zealand showed that Hamilton's frog was genetically extremely similar to the Maud Island frog, despite the fact that the 2 species differed significantly in size. The decision was made to combine these 2 species into one, and the population went from about 300 to about 20,000, as the Maud Island frog was considerably more abundant, surviving on 2 other islands nearby. This led to the IUCN downlisting the species from endangered to vulnerable. Still, the population on Stevens Island remains very small and morphologically distinct. The Bali Myna is a species I've wanted to cover for a long time, as I personally lived in Indonesia for over 4 years, with much of that time being spent in Bali. Bali is a province in Indonesia, famous for its rich culture, vibrant tourist sector, and amazing natural beauty. The island's only endemic species of vertebrate is the incredibly beautiful Bali Myna. Famous for its white plumage, flowing crest, and blue eye patches, the species was designated as the faunal emblem of Bali in 1991. It was put on the 200 rupiah coin, and a statue of the bird was erected on Sunset Row in the capital city of Denpasar. As the species was catapulted to national notoriety, its ongoing existence was put in grave danger. The Bali Myna was already struggling to survive on the island. In the 1980s, there were only an estimated 350 birds left in the wild, all restricted to the West Bali National Park on the northwestern end of the island. But within 2 years of being made Bali's official symbol, the species was almost extinct in the wild. This is because Indonesia has a tradition that is a serious threat to local wildlife: keeping caged birds. Hundreds of thousands of rare and endangered birds are trafficked through Indonesia annually, leading to the country having the second highest number of endangered bird species in the world. Species with bright plumage and beautiful songs are particularly prized, and these birds are at a very high risk of being trapped and sold to private collectors at high prices. The birds are kept as status symbols. The rarer the bird you have, the wealthier you appear. And to make matters worse, bird song competitions have become popular in the country, with a growing number of people purchasing wild-caught birds in order to compete. The Bali Myna was being trapped much faster than they could reproduce. Despite hundreds of caged birds being released into West Bali National Park through the 1990s, by 2015, fewer than 100 were left in the wild, with few signs of public interest in stopping the illegal trafficking of the species. A breeding program was established to try to get their numbers back up. 12 breeders were given 30 birds each, with the understanding that they were required to release only 10% of the birds produced back into the wild. The remaining 90% were allowed to be sold as cage birds to meet and maintain the demand for this critically endangered species. In a desperate effort to try to save the birds, 2 new populations were established. One was on the offshore island of Nusa Penida. Here, it was hoped wildlife traffickers would have a harder time working undetected. Despite over 100 birds being released on the island, in 2015, only 15 could be found surviving there. This was well below the 200 birds that should have been surviving there had they not been being poached. The other new population was introduced around some small villages just north of Ubud in the center of the island. The villagers were taught to protect the species, and a fine of over $600 was put in place for anyone caught hunting or trapping the mynas. Despite all of the conservation efforts, the demand to own Bali Mynas remains incredibly high. There are estimated to be fewer than 50 of the birds surviving in the wild today. Meanwhile, over 1,000 remain caged in captivity across Indonesia. Without serious changes in public opinion on conservation and on the tradition of keeping birds in cages, the Bali Myna may soon be totally extinct in the wild, along with many other species of Indonesian bird. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to help me out with a like, and maybe comment which one you found to be the most interesting. Also, check out my other 3 videos on rare species. You'll find the playlist linked in the video description below. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link for that is also in the video description below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.